While he was waiting for the subway, a terrifying roar suddenly echoed from deep within the tunnel. Moments later, the stones on the ground began to levitate, and the strange sight immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. He turned and sprinted toward the station exit, but as the unknown creature approached, people's eyes began to twist in a grotesque way. As if their souls had been ripped away, they ran straight into the tunnel without hesitation. Even as the train blasted its horn in warning, they made no attempt to dodge it. Worse still, in the chaos, Jack was shoved to the very edge of the platform. At the last possible second, he shoved the person in front of him aside and barely avoided falling onto the tracks. He stumbled out of the station and ran as fast as he could toward his daughter's school. But when he reached the classroom, the horrific scene inside froze him in place. The children were huddled together in terror, while their teacher lay lifeless on the desk in a gruesome state. Forcing down his fear, Jack grabbed his daughter and rushed out, only to find the streets in even worse chaos. To shield her from the hellish scene, he covered her head tightly with his coat. Luckily, as they sprinted through the streets, they encountered his wife, who had come looking for them by car. The family quickly checked on each other, then pulled into a tight embrace. But just as they were about to flee, a runaway car suddenly struck and killed his wife. In just a few months, once thriving Barcelona had turned into a city of the dead. Anyone who had seen the creature's true form ended their own life in horrifying ways. The survivors were forced to hide underground, and every time they ventured out, they had to blindfold themselves to avoid the creatures. But in the apocalypse, the most terrifying thing wasn't the lack of resources, it was the darkness of human nature. With the arrival of the creatures, a sinister group known as the Seers emerged. They believed that being killed by the creatures would grant them passage to heaven, so they began hunting survivors and forcing them to literally open their eyes. Meanwhile, Jack and his daughter survived by staying hidden in a house, relying on blindfolds to stay alive. On his daughter's birthday, Jack excitedly brought out a simple cake to celebrate with her. Just as they were enjoying this rare moment of happiness, violent banging suddenly erupted at the door. A group of Seers burst in, knocked them unconscious, and dragged them up to the rooftop. When Jack came to, the sight of the open sky startled him, and he quickly told his daughter to keep her eyes shut. But the group's leader stepped forward, drew an eye symbol on her face, and forced her to open her eyes. After a brief struggle, her pupils began to change, and she calmly walked toward the edge of the rooftop. Jack rushed forward to save her, but he was too late. Watching her fall to her death shattered him completely. He turned and charged at the leader in madness, only to come face to face with the creature itself. His pupils began to mutate, and a pair of small hands gently clasped his tightly clenched fists. His daughter, who had just died, mysteriously reappeared alive at his side. Jack was overwhelmed with joy, unaware that a deadly trap meant just for him had already taken shape. That day, Jack and his daughter were scavenging the streets blindfolded when the sound of rolling tires echoed nearby. Realizing it was a group of survivors out searching, he quickly told his daughter to hide and stepped forward to greet them. He claimed he had been injured while exploring and begged them for help, but the survivors ignored him completely and turned to leave. Seeing this, Jack quickly claimed he knew where to find a generator, stopping them in their tracks. Though still suspicious of Jack, the promise of light and warmth from the generator convinced them to let him join. Soon, Jack followed them to a makeshift shelter, set up in an abandoned bus station. The leader warmly explained the situation and asked their medic Annie to tend to his injuries. That night, while everyone slept inside the bus, Jack quietly got up and slipped outside. He slipped past the patrol officers and sneaked into the office, where he took all the bus keys. He then returned to the bus driver's cab and jammed the door lock with a spoon. Soon, Annie was awakened by faint noises and saw Jack sitting in the driver's cabin, with keys scattered across the floor. Realizing he was starting the bus, she rushed to stop him, but it was already too late. Jack started the engine, trapping everyone inside and waking them all with the roar. They stumbled forward trying to stop him, only to be blocked by the locked doors. As the bus was about to crash through the station, Annie jammed the emergency hammer against the spoon and kicked the door open. A man rushed in and struggled with Jack for control of the wheel, sending the bus careening wildly through the station. In the end, before everyone's horrified eyes, the bus slammed into an obstacle and flipped over. When things finally went quiet, Jack crawled out of the wreck, with the man following behind him. Just as he moved to confront Jack, he followed Jack's gaze and saw the creature's true form. The man's eyes instantly changed, and without hesitation, he picked up a shard of glass and ended his own life. But in Jack's eyes, the man transformed into a streak of light and ascended into the sky. He then turned to Annie, who had somehow crawled out, and violently forced her eyes open. Annie, who had been screaming, suddenly went quiet and walked toward the overturned bus, a blissful smile on her face. Moments later, the bus exploded violently, and everyone was transformed into streams of white light rising into the sky. As Jack reveled in the sight, his daughter quietly appeared, took his hand and praised him for what he had done. In his daughter's words, those terrifying creatures were actually six-winged angels sent to guide people to the afterlife. As long as enough people opened their eyes, Jack would one day be reunited with his wife and daughter. From that moment, he was completely under his daughter's control. going out to find survivors and using any excuse to get close, only to trick them into taking off their blindfolds. Before long, Jack and his daughter spotted another target, and Jack, blindfolded, carefully approached the woman. But with his vision blocked, he accidentally stepped on broken glass, instantly alerting her. As the woman called out to him, he tried to inch closer, silently, without making a sound. Suddenly, a hunting dog lunged and knocked him to the ground, and her companions quickly rushed over. Realizing he'd been spotted, Jack quickly lied, saying he'd just been robbed to explain his wary behavior. His story eased their suspicions slightly, until the two dogs suddenly began barking furiously at something in the distance. Clearly, the unseen creatures were closing in, and the group quickly spun around, ready to flee. Seizing the moment, Jack once again used the generator story to slip into their group. Soon, with the dogs leading the way, they made their way into a bell tower. The moment he removed his blindfold, the survivors eagerly pulled out a map and asked about the generator. With no real answer to give, Jack was forced to admit he had lied just to seek shelter. This confession enraged one of the men, who grabbed Jack by the collar, ready to hurl him out of the bell tower. At that moment, a young girl stepped forward to stop him, but she couldn't communicate with the group because of the language barrier. Fortunately, Jack knew a bit of German and used it to translate for her, earning himself a spot in the shelter. After some conversation, they learned the girl's name was Amy. When the apocalypse hit, she and her mother had miraculously survived by hiding inside a vehicle. Later, they heard on the radio about a safe shelter in the mountains, but she and her mother got separated on the way. Based on the map the girl drew, an older woman recognized the place as a mountain nearby. This gave everyone a glimmer of hope. Though the journey would be dangerous, staying meant certain death. After a vote, they decided to set out for the shelter at first light. That night, Jack quietly approached the two dogs and used a knife to make a small cut in their leashes. The next morning, they set off full of hope, unaware that Jack's daughter had silently joined the group. Soon, the dogs began barking wildly ahead, and Jack quietly removed his blindfold to look into the distance. A cold wind swept through, and voices of loved ones whispered in their ears, urging them to open their eyes. The dogs suddenly broke free and ran off, scattering the tightly grouped survivors. One of the men went off alone, feeling his way forward until he reached a car. He suddenly heard a faint whimper from a dog, and panicking, tore off his blindfold, only to find swirling leaves in front of him. Under the control of an unseen force, he slammed himself straight into a nearby car without hesitation. At that moment, the real hunting dogs returned, surrounding them. But in the chaos, one of the dog's blindfolds was ripped off. It barked furiously at something unseen in the distance, but accidentally injured the old man who had come over to check. Meanwhile, Bailey and Daisy found an apartment, and he quickly called the others to take refuge there. Seeing this, Jack quickly put his blindfold back on and blended into the group again. Only once the door was completely secured did everyone finally exhale in relief. The old man's injury was severe, and he soon developed a high fever. Without proper treatment, he could die from sepsis at any moment. To save him, Bailey and the others scoured the building for any useful medicine. They opened the door to an apartment, carefully put on their blindfolds, and split up to search. Jack made his way to the dining area, looked around briefly, then removed his blindfold. He assured Bailey it was safe, but when Bailey removed his blindfold, he saw a wide-open window. Just as he turned to question Jack, he was suddenly compelled to grab a knife and end his own life. Strangely, this time Jack didn't see the usual light rising into the sky. As he stood there in confusion, Daisy, hearing the commotion, made her way over to see what had happened. Jack quickly lied, claiming Bailey had accidentally removed his blindfold. Just then, his daughter appeared beside him, urging him to remove Daisy's blindfold. What had just happened shook Jack's beliefs, and after a moment of hesitation, he chose to spare Daisy. Fortunately, Daisy found a dose of antibiotics in another room, barely helping the old man pull through. The next day, after gathering their gear, they set out again, and along the way, Jack saw many victims brutally killed by the cult. A massive eye symbol was painted on the wall, and then it began to warp and twist before his eyes. Before Jack could react, a motorcycle blocked their path. Clearly, the seers had tracked them down. Jack immediately grabbed the group and fled, but the motorcycle quickly closed in. At the critical moment, he led them around a corner, just barely managing to shake off their pursuer. But the old man at the back was struck and fell to the ground, and his wife rushed over, grabbing his hand in a desperate attempt to lift him up. A cold, eerie wind swept through, and the fallen leaves began to rise into the air. Realizing there was no escape, the couple removed their blindfolds, choosing to face death together one last time. Meanwhile, Jack led Daisy into a house, but his smooth, practiced movements aroused her suspicion. She suddenly snatched off Jack's blindfold and immediately noticed the truth. He had been deceiving them all along. As Daisy broke down, Jack tried to explain, but his daughter appeared again, urging him to deal with them immediately. The constant accusations and pressure drove Jack to the brink of collapse, and he began arguing with his daughter in frustration. Seeing this, Daisy hurriedly grabbed Amy and ran upstairs. Before Jack could catch up, they put on their blindfolds and made their way to the rooftop. As they searched for a way out, Jack caught up and tried to persuade them to remove their blindfolds and go to paradise. Daisy immediately swung a stick wildly, trying to fend him off, but she accidentally slipped and fell onto a nearby ledge. Jack slowly crouched in front of Amy, soothing her while hesitantly reaching for her blindfold. His daughter hovered nearby, constantly urging him to act. Torn between his conscience and her demands, Jack faced an impossible choice. As he struggled to make a decision, he glanced down and saw the pendant he had given Amy just days before. It was the very first gift he and his wife had given their daughter. This reminded him of his daughter, who had once been persecuted. Amid his daughter's heart-wrenching cries, he didn't remove his blindfold. Instead, he pulled Amy into a protective embrace. Once Daisy regained consciousness on the platform, Jack recounted the ordeal he and Amy had endured, and decided to escort them both to the shelter. Before Daisy could fully let go of her suspicion, members of the Sears organization had already closed in. Seeing the stairwell completely blocked, the three of them risked moving to the rooftop, intending to climb down from the platform. But the pursuers quickly followed. Seeing the three blindfolded, one of them leapt down from the platform without hesitation and approached. Suddenly, Jack lunged at her, and they immediately engaged in a struggle. Only when she ripped off his blindfold did she realize he too was a seer. Overwhelmed by rage, she broke free, threw Jack to the ground, and tried to take down this traitor of the organization. At the last second, Jack forcefully pushed her off, then pulled the other two inside a nearby car. The roaring engine attracted even more seers, who pounded on the windows, trying to pull them out. Luckily, Jack managed to drive the car out, clinging tightly to the wheel as he sped toward the shelter. Soon they arrived at the cable car station at the mountain's base. Jack jammed the wheel to block the entrance with the car. With the seers closing in, Jack dragged the two from the car, ignited a towel, and stuffed it into the fuel tank. As the seers drew near, a violent explosion erupted. To buy more time, Jack decided to stay behind, holding off the pursuers so the others could escape. But when Daisy and Amy reached the top, they discovered the cable car controls were corroded and wouldn't work. Their hope for escape vanished completely, and Daisy felt utter despair and helplessness. As she stared hopelessly at the cable car, she suddenly noticed a massive iron bell ahead. A desperate idea struck her. She swung the bell with all her strength. The unknown creatures below were drawn to the sound. With leaves swirling around them, they rushed toward the two girls. Fortunately, the force also activated the cable car controls. The girls hurriedly closed their eyes, evading the creature's attack. Listening closely to the cable car's movement, she waited until it approached, then leapt forward, clutching Amy tightly and landing safely inside. Meanwhile below, Jack drew an iron rod and confronted the seer's leader. The leader kept manipulating him in God's name, even taking the form of his daughter to get close. This time, Jack didn't lose his composure. He recalled the scene when the leader had killed his daughter. He swung the iron rod and grappled with the leader, ultimately choosing to take them both down together. In the end, Daisy and Amy reached the shelter safely, and Amy was reunited with her mother. The apocalypse's darkness and humanity's corruption wove a deadly web, and Jack, blinded by obsession, had walked toward destruction. Yet the remaining love of a father awakened him, and he used his life to protect the last shred of hope. In doing so, the apocalyptic maze built on lies finally came to its true end.